Hey class, welcome to this brief presentation. It's a primer to comics. Essentially what I'm going to do today is try to introduce you to how comics work, essentially. For a lot of you this won't be anything new, but for some of us it might just be a nice review. I'll try to make it quick and try to get to the point, but essentially what we're going to talk about today is how comics work and how this relates to neurocomic and deep dark fears, which we will be analyzing this week. So let's look at our first comic strip here. I think the first things that people misunderstand about comics is how they can be used and what their purpose is. So I've done research in the past on comics, and I've found that a lot of students and people think that comics have to be, one, funny, and two, about superheroes, among other things. But you'll notice that that's not necessarily true. Here, you're going to find just a simple hand-drawn drawing that looks like it was probably done on a napkin. And it's just a simple little story. And if anything, it's kind of sad or sweet, depending on how you look at it. But it's very simply done, which I think is a great introduction to the potential of comics, that it can be simple or it can be complex, but it needs to tell a story. You'll also notice a big difference here. If you look up in the corner, you'll see that there is a meteorite? I don't know, scientists help me out, coming down, which is what many scientists believe it led to the last extinction of the dinosaurs. However, why that matters is in comics, it's called sequential. In other words, it means something comes after something previous. So what separates a comic from, say, a photograph or a painting is it implies movement of story. So we'll look at that throughout the presentation today. So the first thing we're going to look at is single panel comics. Now, single panel comics are primarily what many historians believe are the first type of comics. They've been appearing for hundreds of years. They have all kinds of different forms, but primarily they usually tell a single gag or a single joke. One of the most popular single panel comics in history has been The Far Side, which had its run in the newspapers in the 1980s to the 1990s. Some of you might remember it or have seen books lying around your dad's office or something with them in it. But they usually relied on a simple joke. But most single panel comics are usually political in nature. That's been their history. So you'll probably have seen them in a newspaper or online, usually telling a political story. In this case, you'll see a simple one panel thing where it's talking about libraries. I tried to keep these political examples pretty light so as not to upset any of you, since this seems to be a very politically minded class. But the other interesting thing about a single panel comic is, even though it only has one picture, sometimes, like you'll notice in this one, it can be divided into two, like this. But it still carries on the same idea of one picture. It also can be done even more interestingly, like in this case, where you have multiple things occurring, but all within one frame. I remember earlier when I said that things have to be sequential or they have to move. This is a perfect example of that. A painting can capture a moment, like, a seascape or anything you'd like, but a comic needs to show a story. Something had to have happened before and something's about to happen after. Alright, so the most common type of comic, well, not necessarily common, but one that most people are familiar with, is the joke setup. This usually is a 2 or 3 panel joke. I'm going to show you a few examples of these. This is a pretty standard joke right here. Quick setup, quick punchline. Boom, boom. Visual gag. And that's how it works. The more common method is to use 3 panels. Sometimes it requires a lot of words. Sometimes it doesn't require hardly any. With the move of comics to the internet, though, one thing that we've noticed is the ability to do things that we haven't done in the past in comics. Like, for example, in this comic, you'll notice that it's probably a highly inappropriate joke in the sense, not in the sense that it's crude or sexualized or violent, but just that the joke is just off color or poor taste, which for many is what makes it funny. In fact, this comic strip frequently does that, and it's very well known for that. It's called the Perry Bible Fellowship. But anyway, it's allowed the medium to explore topics that they couldn't in newspapers due to restraints from advertising. Same thing here. This is a 4-panel version of the same thing. This being a violent joke. Hopefully that's not too intense for you. I have shown this to high school students, so I figured it would be okay for us college students here. But also in the same format, not everything has to be a joke. So these are serious but short comics where they either just tell something simple and sweet like this story, or like our book Deep Dark Fears, they go into something a little bit darker but might still be slightly funny or lighthearted, depending on how you look at it. Sometimes, too, they can just be a nice longer story that might make you feel good, like this example here called Everybody, where it just tells a nice little story about how, life works. All right. Another misconception I found as I was doing research on the past on comics is a lot of people don't realize that comics can portray things that are nonfiction. Although once you see examples, it won't seem that strange to you. Like here's a classic propaganda piece from America, coming from Superman, telling us that we need to be nice to people because everyone's different, so let's respect them. Which also happens to be kind of Rogerian in nature, which is what we're studying this semester. So that's kind of interesting and nice. But it can also be something more informative, like this is a series of comics that just teach people from small towns how to behave in a big city. So nothing too complicated, but that's the idea. This should be probably familiar to a lot of you. This is a comic strip that is often used in an airplane. While it might not be exciting or interesting, it essentially tells a story through pictures that go in an order. Since the purpose of our class is rhetoric, here's a few comics that in particular look at how rhetoric works and how people are persuaded and how people are often blinded by their own biases. So Chainsaw Suit frequently does this with one of the most accurate things I've ever seen. Coming here. So anyway, take this comic to heart as you begin your research to look for things that actively disagree with what you believe. Otherwise, you will just find yourself in an echo chamber, hearing what you want to hear, which has become something that's very easy to do with modern technology. But here's a more serious comic, in the sense that it's multiple panels, trying to showcase how media can persuade us through various angles of a single photograph, or how they present their information. So if you notice on the left, it looks like soldiers being violent. On the right, it looks like soldiers being benevolent. And in the middle, you see it's a little bit of both. So just kind of a nice example of how things can be presented. Here's a nice example of the failure to understand how not everyone has had your same experience, which is why anecdotes or personal stories often don't hold a lot of weight in argument, because your personal experience is not proof, although it can be interesting at times, but it can also be funny, as it is here in this comic strip. Slightly different, but still helpful, is comic strips can inform us in the sense of rhetoric being used to inform and help us understand a concept. So you'll notice here that this nice comic with actually hardly any words shows us how to tell the difference between the definition of poisonous and venomous. And then here is another Chainsaw Suit critique and attack of modern news television programs that often bring in opposing sides to discuss a topic, and neither side really says anything that's of any note. But let's look at the medium itself of comics. Like, what's its purpose and how does it work? I've been talking about some things like panels and stuff, but comics works in a very particular way, and most people pick up on it naturally. but sometimes it takes a little help. But the thing about comics too is that it can play with how it works, as you'll see in this example here with time. Because essentially how it's supposed to work is each panel is supposed to be a progression in time. We're supposed to move forward. And here this kind of messes with that. But comics do all kinds of different things. You'll notice in this example that it's kind of hard to tell a story of any sort, but it still follows a progression in a sense, in a scrolling pattern. But here's what we're talking about. If you'll notice at the top it says panel. When we're talking about comics, we say the word panels, and that's those boxes. If you see those boxes, those are panels. We also talk about a thing called a gutter, and that's those spaces in between the panels. The gutter. And the gutter is the spot where your brain fills in the information that is not there, but you make it there. So panels and gutters become an important thing, something to think about as you begin analyzing these comics for the assignment. Here's another example of that. Here's just a straightforward scrolling comic that plays with time and narrative in many multiple ways, all of that time passing in the gutters as a boy ages in a simple story and we learn the life lesson. One thing though, we've been primarily talking about short comics, which is fine, but there's also larger comics, as you currently own 2 of them. So you have Deep Dark Fears and Neurocomic. These are examples of a myriad of comic books that are out there that you can buy, you can rent, you can get at the library, etc. They're called graphic novels or comic books, depending on who you talk to. The name graphic novel can be strange because you'll notice that novel is usually used to explain a long story, but Deep Dark Fears is snippets of short stories, and Neurocomic is non-fiction and fiction mixed together. So it's kind of confusing to call it a novel. Nevertheless, that's the title that we have. So you'll notice that in Neurocomic, it kind of shows you a little bit of how to play with the medium. Like in these panels here, it says, for example, when an object changes position from panel to panel, we assume it's the same object at 2 different moments in time, but actually they are 2 independent pictures. The connection is only in our head. So why does any of this matter? Well, we're analyzing these comic books this week. So one of the biggest things that students confuse between analysis and evaluation, which we did last week, is what they mean. So students often want to evaluate on an analysis assignment. But remember, an evaluation is merely a judgment. So you were judging, is this good or not? And then if you think it's not good, you have to come up with sophisticated criteria to say why it is not. The same applies if you think it's good. It's to move beyond saying, oh, that movie sucked. And then you ask your friend, well, why did it suck? And they say, because it was the worst. Those aren't valid criteria. You need to explain, well, why did it suck? Well, it had bad cinematography. The writing was poor. Things like that. But analysis goes beyond that. Analysis looks at what was it really about. So when you're looking at Neurocomic and Deep Dark Fears, what you want to do is look at why are these created the way they are? Why was the art done in the way that it was? Why are the panels organized like how they are? What were the authors and artists trying to portray? Why use a comic book at all? Like what medium? Why use this medium when there are other mediums available? Was there anything gained? Was there anything lost? Could we have done something else? Those are the types of questions you'll be looking at. And what's really going on? What's the meaning here? That's what you're looking at in an analysis. So hopefully this will help you understand a little bit more about how comics work. If you have any questions about it or would like to know more, please feel free to email me, and I'll talk to you all soon digitally.